Well, let's start with the easier one here. The amplitude. Amplitude. 3. Amplitude is the number multiplying the trig function. It's easy to find. What does that mean, though? What does it mean the amplitude's 3? Goes up to 3, down to negative 3, and then back up to 3 and down to negative 3. It's this one here that I imagine is going to be a little bit tricky for us. First of all, the formula is 2 pi divided by b. This is the formula that helps you find the period. I'm going to ask you a tricky question here. You ready? What's the number in front of theta? Because that's what b is. B is the number in front of theta. I heard a 1 and I heard a 1/2. If I were to point at theta and say, all right, what's the number in front of it? A lot of students will say, well, there's just a 1 in front of it. And there is a 1 in front of it, but what else is happening to that 1? It's being divided by 2, and that's where it gets a little tricky. So I want you to do this. Draw a box around this theta over 2. This is just something you're going to have to remember to look for because it happens all the time. Theta over 2 is the same thing as 1/2 times theta. They're equal to each other. And it's more commonly written as theta over 2. But you just got to remember it's 1/2 times theta. So I'm going to ask it again. What number is in front of theta? 1/2 is in front of theta. So that's your b value. So it's 2 pi divided by 1/2. Oh man, fractions. 2 pi divided by 1/2 equals 4 pi. Now I do expect most of you in here to be able to just figure that out in your head because it's something you ought to be able to do. If you're still a little concerned about how the fractions are working, you have 2 choices. You could either use your calculator or go back and take a year of 7th grade and relearn your fractions. I would rather use the calculator than have to repeat 7th grade or 6th grade, whenever you learned about fractions. But 2 divided by 1/2, it's pretty easy to type in, pretty easy to hit enter. 2 divided by 1/2 is 4, so it's 4 pi. Alright, so I'm asking you to graph 2 cycles. Let's go through the process again. If the period is 4 pi, then you're going to start at 0 and come out to 4 pi. There's the end of 1 cycle. I'm asking you to graph 2 cycles, though, so the second cycle is going to end at 8 pi. 1 cycle stops at 4 pi, then the second cycle stops at 8 pi. Now I'm going to ask you to label halfway between each cycle. So if one cycle's from 0 to 4 pi, halfway would be 2 pi, and then in between the second cycle would be 6 pi. Those aren't spaced out very evenly. Oh well. And then I want you to mark halfway between each of those. You don't have to label them, but at least mark them. These just help your graphs look a little more accurate. And the amplitude's 3, so you're going up to positive 3 on the y-axis, down to negative 3, up to 3, down to negative 3 on the y-axis, because that's your amplitude. Where does the sine function start? 0, 0. Where are we going now? The next tick mark goes up to 3. That's the highest point of its amplitude. And then at 0, 2 pi comes to 0. Then it goes to its lowest point. And then the cycle ends exactly where it started, at 0. So there's one cycle. Goes up to 3, down to negative 3, back up to 0. Then the cycle repeats. Goes up to 3, down to negative 3, back up to 0. So you just gotta graph it as carefully as you can. Easy peasy, right? Whoa. I don't know where the purple came from. I'm not digging the purple here, so maybe 2 sine 60. There we go. Well, this one's got some really weird fractions in it. That's alright, fractions are pretty easy, huh? Right? You gotta keep telling yourself that. Okay, I'm gonna say something and then I'm gonna ask a question and hopefully you're gonna be able to answer the question correctly. An amplitude is a distance. Okay, an amplitude, it is a distance. It's half the distance between the highest and lowest point. Okay, so now I'm going to ask you, what is the amplitude? So for this particular function, what's the amplitude? 2. Okay, the amplitude is not negative 2. Amplitudes can be negative because an amplitude is a distance. All the minus sign means is it starts at 0, 0 and goes down to its lowest point first instead of up to its highest point. Okay, so when I ask you the amplitude, it's never negative, always positive. Amplitude's 2. You got to be careful here. Period is 2 pi divided by b. So it's 2 pi divided by 6. 2 pi divided by 6. Come on now. What is that? Two over 6 is the same as 1 over 3, so it's 1 pi over 3, or just pi thirds. So, yeah, one cycle is going to end at pi thirds. Where does the second cycle end? How far is it from here to here?
From where to where?
From here to here.
Pi thirds.
Then how far is it from here to here? Well, isn't the cycle pi thirds? So if this is pi thirds, that's another pi thirds. What's pi thirds plus pi thirds? 2 pi thirds. Each cycle has a length of pi thirds. So if you add pi thirds and pi thirds, you get 2 pi thirds. Oh, man. That one almost had your heads explode. I thought, I'm afraid to ask this question. What's halfway between the first cycle? Pi over 6. Now during the test, you're not just going to be able to sit back and wait for somebody else to tell you all the answers. You're going to have to be able to come up with these on your own. So if you're not able to do the fractions in your head, what's your other alternate? You could do that. You could go back and repeat 6th grade. Use your calculator, you guys. If I'm asking you what half of pi thirds is, just forget about the pi and just use the fraction. 1/3 divided in half. Isn't that going to tell you what half of 1/3 is?
Yeah.
So hit enter. It tells you some goofy decimal, so turn it back into a fraction, and it's 1/6.
Second fraction.
Hit math and then enter, enter. So it's pi over 6 is halfway. All right, this may cause some of you to go into a coma, but I'm going to ask, what's halfway between this cycle? I heard a couple of you mumble it. Say it louder. Close. One more sixth. Yeah. I'm not blaming you guys for this, but you have a very, very big weakness in fraction. I'm just telling you. I'm just being honest. Okay, you have a pretty big weakness with fractions. Now, that's not necessarily your fault. Other teachers should have taught you. Maybe it is your fault. Maybe you just didn't pay attention and waited for somebody else to yell out answers. But at any rate, is this 1 pi over 6, yes or no? Everybody needs to pay attention to this, because at some point you're going to have to be able to be comfortable with fractions. So put your pencils down. Let's do a little fraction lesson here. Look up at the screen. Is this 1 pi over 6, yes or no?
Yes.
Is this 2 pi over 6, yes or no?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
So if this is 1 pi over 6 and this is 2 pi over 6, then this would be 3 pi over 6, which is pi halves. Okay, let's do that one more time. This is 1 pi over 6. This is 2 pi over 6. This would be 3 pi over 6. What would this one be? 4 pi over 6, which is 2 pi over 3rd. Okay? Fractions don't need to be as difficult as a lot of you make them out to be. They really don't. It's just a bunch of patterns for the most part. At any rate, are we good now? I still want you to mark these halfway points, but you don't have to label them, because that would really ruin your day. But go ahead and see if you can mark up the rest of that graph. Okay. Did we get it?
Yes.
Yes. Well, having shown you that. So, that is true. So really the only thing that concerns me, you guys, is you recognize what the minus sign does. You still start at 0, 0, but the minus sign forces you to go down to the lowest point first. And then up to the highest point, and the cycle ends at pi thirds. And then it repeats, down to -2, up to +2, down to 0. Is it what you guys had? Pretty much? Ooh, I got all the dots. All right. There are a couple questions on your homework that are, I wouldn't say more challenging. You just have to think backwards. Like this one here. Example, write the equation. Rather than being given an equation and having to graph it, you're going to either be given the graph already or given the amplitude and period, and you're going to have to come up with the equation. So, like for example, if I told you the amplitude is 4 and the period is 4 pi, you've got to come up with the equation. Now, let's just do this first one together. The equation has to look like this. Y equals A times the sine of bx. So, yeah, where does the amplitude go? in front. So A is equal to 4. Here's where a lot of students get confused, at least at the beginning. This is not what goes in front. Actually, I think we're using theta, not x. Theta. Anyway, x is the same as theta. But anyway, this is not b. 4 pi is not b. This is not the number that goes in front of theta. You guys following me here? You need to understand this. This number here for amplitude, yeah, that's a. That goes right here in front of sine. But this is not b. Here's what has to happen. It's just a little bit of an equation you got to solve. The period of a sine function is equal to 2 pi over b. Isn't that what we've been doing? 2 pi over b? What is the period of our trig function? So then you replace this phrase period, you replace that with 4 pi. So 4 pi is equal to 2 pi over b. Yes? I just want to make sure we're clear. Where does 4 pi come from? That's the period for our trig function, right? Is it always going to be 4 pi? No, it's just because that's what we've been given. Where did this come from? 2 pi over b. That's the equation for period. Now, all we're doing is solving an equation. We're solving for b. There are different ways you could probably solve this one. Some of you might even be able to solve this in your head, but I don't expect everybody to be able to do that. So here's what I would do. Make a fraction out of that, 4 pi over 1. Does cross multiplying sound familiar? Or over there at the junior high, they call it the fish method. I hate that, by the way. But does that sound familiar? Fish? I don't know where fish has nothing to do with math, but
Just because you go like this, and then you make a fish.
all it is cross multiplying. 1 times 2 pi is,
Look, you made a fish tail.
I didn't, there's no fish in here. 1 times 2 pi is 2 pi. 4 pi times b is 4 pi b. What are we solving for? We're solving for b. b is being multiplied by 4 pi, so how do you get b by itself? Divide by 4 pi. So b equals, careful, what's 2 pi divided by 4 pi? The pi's would cancel. And then 2 divided by 4. 2 divided by 4 is 1/2. We okay on the head? 2 divided by 4, last time I checked, is 1/2. So b is equal to 1/2. So your equation becomes y equals 4 times the sine of 1/2 theta. Now it is kind of unusual to write it like this. I'd take this, and I'm pretty sure Math Excel would, but it's more common to write it as theta over 2. I'd accept either one. So, oh no!
Oh my gosh.
Okay. It's another example. Oh, that got all sorts of messed up. Dang it. I'm going to start over. So now you're going to have to do the same thing, but rather than being told what the amplitude and period are, just straight up, you're going to have to find it off of a graph. Okay, there it is. Copy that down real quick. Let's not take too much time with it. Don't worry about the parts on the left. Really, all you need a graph is enough to be able to tell what the amplitude and period is. But you need to have some kind of a picture in your notes. again, all you need to graph is enough of this graph to be able to tell what the amplitude and period is. That's a pi symbol right there. I know it looks like an X. That's a pi over 2 right there. There's a pi. That's a pi right there. Can you see that better? Really, the main thing is what's the amplitude, what's the period. Amplitude, pretty easy to find. So if I were to trace along this graph, starts here at 0, 0, goes up to what? Then goes down to -3, and here's where the cycle ends right there. That's all the information we need. What's the amplitude based off of this? Amplitude's 3, and then the cycle starts here, it goes up, down, and ends here. I know it's kind of hard to see, but that's pi halves. So what's the period? Pi halves. The period's pi halves. That's where one cycle ends. Starts at 0, ends at pi halves. So the period is pi halves. So we need to do the same thing we did on the last problem. The equation needs to look like y equals a times the sine of b theta so the period is equal to 2 pi over b. Oh man, that's way big. There you go. So the period for this function, or this graph here, is pi halves. So you're going to say pi halves is equal to 2 pi over b. And I'd imagine some of you could just look at this and tell me straight up that b equals 4. Okay. If you can't see that just by comparing ratios, then you can solve this by cross multiplying. Or the fish method, if that's what you like to call it. Is this what they do? Woo! Is that what they call it, fish? And then they probably go like this. Is that what they call it, fish? And then I'm sure you're... Is this why they call it fish? I'm sure that's why.
Why don't you like fishes?
Well, it's just... what does fish have to do with it?
You're a swingle.
It's cross multiplying. That's the mathematical definition of this. Cross multiplying. 2 times 2 pi is 4 pi. Pi times b is pi times b. We're trying to get b by itself, so you divide by pi and cancel it. So yeah, b equals 4. So the equation becomes y equals 3 times the sine of 4 theta. B is 4, so that's the number that goes in front of theta. Okay, we're set up. We gotta pick up the pace, y'all. So buckle up, hang on for dear life. We've talked about sine. It's time to talk about cosine. So just like we started with sine, let's start with a table here. We're almost done. We have about 12 minutes, so quit your whining. That was a bad whine right there. It's the same x values or theta values we used for sine: 0, pi halves, pi, 3 pi halves, and 2 pi. What's that? These are the same values we used for sine. And the reason I chose these is because these were pretty easy to find on the unit circle. 0 and pi halves, 3 pi halves. Who's got a unit circle? I need those of you that's got your unit circles out. I need your help. Remember, cosine is equal to x values on the unit circle. So go to 0 and tell me the x value. The x value is 0 degrees, or 0 radians rather. Come on now. 1. Now go up to pi halves. Tell me the x value. Say it loud. Now go to pi and tell me the x value. Now go to 3 pi halves. And then go to 2 pi. Do you see a similar pattern here as with sine? If you went one more time around the unit circle, it would just be 0, -1, 0, and 1. So let's draw a graph. On the y-axis, just label 1 and -1 because that's how high and how low the cosine is, 1 to -1. And then label pi halves, pi, 3 pi halves, 2 pi, 5 pi halves, 3 pi, 7 pi halves, and 4 pi. Just a quick question before we graph this. How many cycles is this? It went 1, 0, -1, 0. 1, 0, -1, 0. How many patterns repeated themselves? Here's one of the patterns. Here's another pattern. That's 2 cycles, isn't it? Most important difference between sine and cosine, the most important difference, you guys, between sine and cosine is where the graph starts. Where did the sine function always start? 0, 0, right at the origin. Yes? Take a look at where we're going to start with cosine. 0, 1. The cosine, this is what I want you to put here, a little star by this. Cosine starts at the top / bottom of amplitude. The cosine is either always going to start at the top of its amplitude, or it might start at the bottom of it. What do you think would make it start at the bottom and not the top? If there was a negative in front, exactly. Man, you guys are sharp today, except for some of those fraction problems. But on this, you're being pretty sharp. So we're going to start at 1, pi halves comma 0, pi comma -1, 3 pi halves comma 0, and 2 pi comma 1. There's one cycle. The cycle started at 1 and it ended at 1. Then you start the next cycle. 0, -1, 0, +1. What does this graph look an awful lot like? A snake? I was thinking more like it looks like a sine function, doesn't it? Kind of look like a sine function. Just starts in a different spot. Starts at the top of the amplitude rather than the 0 in the middle. It does kind of look like a snake. Especially if I did this. Do worms stick out their tongue like this?
Is that smiling?
Because he's happy to be here.
Yeah, but you know what's like that setting up
It's his tongue.
Well, you put a hat on and now it's like one of those olden guys. Olden guys.
And a rattle. It's a rattlesnake. Anyway. Let's graph two cycles of the cosine function. We're almost there, guys. We're down to 5 minutes. Let me ask this one more time. What's the biggest difference between cosine and sine?
Starts at 1.
Cosine starts at the top of its amplitude. The sine starts at 0. The cosine starts at the top or bottom. Those are the biggest differences you need to remember. Okay. What's the amplitude? Ooh, here's a tricky question. What's the period? That's the number in front of theta. That's 1/4. Hey, sweet.
I'll be there. That's all right. These guys don't mind. Put that in your office. Yeah. I'll let you borrow it. Let's get you started. Yeah, it takes some time. Okay. How long did it take you? 50 hours. Yeah, it takes time. Well, just gathering everything up. Yeah.
The formula, you guys, the formula is 2 pi over b. So again, here's that question. You got to be careful how you answer it. What's in front of theta? There is a 1 in front, but isn't it being divided by 4? So the number in front of theta is 1/4. And 2 pi divided by 1/4 is 8 pi. So one cycle stops at 8 pi, and then the other cycle stops at 16 pi. I want you to graph two cycles here. What's halfway? 4 pi, and then halfway between 8 and 16 would be 12 pi. And then you got to mark up in between all of those. You don't have to label them, even though for this one it wouldn't be too terrible. And then the amplitude's 3. So it goes as high as 3 down and as low as -3. Remember though, this is cosine, so where are we starting? Starting at the top of its amplitude on the y-axis at 3. The cycle has to end at 3. So over to 8 pi, I'm going to put us up at 3. Where am I going to be down at -3? Where does that happen? Where do I put a -3? At 4 pi, I'm at -3. So it goes through 0 right there, and it goes through 0 right there. There's one cycle. It goes from 3 down to -3, back up to 3. Then it goes back to 0, down to -3, 0, and then it ends the cycle at 3, right where it starts. So there's the cosine. Well, that's all it is.